it gives me a headache sometimes just thinking about what's going on right now in the Middle East and West Asia, because of course you have the situation in Gaza, a months-long campaign now that Israel, with the US's unconditional support, has been waging, a military campaign, a ground operation. Now there appears to be, I know, Alex, you have talked about this, both of you have talked about this on the Duran, this shift to a low intensity conflict. But as the civilian casualties, especially on the Palestinian side, are just enormous, you have what I've seen as a shift from this conflict being relatively contained, although you did have Hezbollah from the very beginning being quite involved to the north. But now it seems like as there's this shift to a low intensity conflict regionally and globally, this conflict's ramifications are growing. We were talking before the program, Alexander, of all of the various assassinations and terrorist attacks, from the Christmas killing by an Israeli drone of Saeed Razi Mousavi, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps leader who's instrumental in its operations with Syria. You have Salah al-Aruri, the one of the top Hamas leaders, killed in Lebanon. And of course, you have now the ISIS, supposedly ISIS has taken responsibility for what happened in Iran on the celebration or commemoration of Qasem Soleimani's murder at the hands of the United States a few years back. Over 100 people killed there in that attack. And of course, you have what's going on in the Red Sea, which is also quite intense. The U.S. Attacking Houthi positions, and of course, the Houthis doing quite a lot of damage to the economic activity that goes through that part of the world. So maybe we can begin, Alexander, with you. Your impressions of where this is actually going, and is this another quagmire? It's feeling more and more like a quagmire that is without really an end in sight.
It is a quagmire. I don't know whether it's without any end in sight, but it is definitely a quagmire, and it is one which is entirely the product. And I think this really does need to be said. It is entirely the product of US policy, or rather the absence of any coherent US policy. Now, it is very interesting, I'm going to put it no more highly than that just at this particular moment, ISIS, that in some ways convenient organization, has just resurfaced and is now claiming responsibility for this really terrible attack in Iran. Now, we've been talking about this whole situation in the Middle East, in the Duran, ever since the events of the 7th of October began. And we have said on the Duran many times that the approach taken by the United States and by Israel of marching into Gaza and trying to achieve a military solution to the problem of Hamas was a mistaken one. We suggested that perhaps a better approach, in fact, definitely a better approach, would have been a diplomatic one which sought to use the mechanisms of the Security Council to get the civilian hostages that have been taken released, to try to establish investigations of what happened on the 7th of October, to bring people into account. There was a lot of sympathy at that time in October for the Israeli position. It was inevitable that if Israel and the United States went for a military solution, that support would be forfeited. And it was. They went for a military solution. They have carried out this terrible war in Gaza. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Massive destruction has been caused. Everybody has seen all of the pictures and films of what's been going on in Gaza. There's a member of my family, a relative of mine, who works in the European Parliament. Yes, I know people who work in the European Parliament. She has been massively disillusioned, both by the actions that Israel has taken and by the stance the United States and the European Union have taken. And the collective West, the United States, Israel, have seen political support for them in the region and globally, as reflected in repeated votes in the General Assembly and the Security Council of the United Nations. And again, Alex and I were talking about this. They've seen global opinion turned against them. So you start to get the sense that there are tensions within the administration. They're also aware that this policy is unpopular with a large fraction of the Democratic Party's coalition in what is looking like a very fraught election year. So you sense that one faction says, we want to stop. We want to find a way out. We can't agree to a ceasefire in Gaza because that would be humiliating. So let's try to get the Israelis to dial down. Let's get them to talk about a low intensity conflict. Let's get them to pull out their tanks and their infantry fighting vehicles and 5 brigades and all of that kind of thing. And let's, at the same time, pull back one of these aircraft carriers we sent to the region, which has been hovering there in the Eastern Mediterranean, not doing very much, but through its mere presence, adding to the sense of crisis and tension and fear that a strike might be underway against Iran and something of that kind might be on the way. So you get those forces of relative moderation. And I stress relative because there's no real conviction behind this. They urge a pullback, and you see the signs of a pullback. And then as soon as that happens, you see the other push from the other side, those who still hanker for a larger war, people like John Bolton, who are now openly demanding a military strike on Iran. He just published an article in the Daily Telegraph in Britain calling for a strike on Iran. And a whole series of events start to happen, even as this sort of retreat appears to be underway, which points in the diametrically opposite direction towards escalation. So you see Mousavi, the Iranian official, being killed. You see an important Hamas official being assassinated in Beirut. You have this major bomb attack in Iran, which kills 100 people, close to the grave of General Soleimani, whom the Americans assassinated. And now you've had this statement from various Western governments, orchestrated by the United States, giving warnings to the Houthis over the events in the Red Sea. So you see that the pendulum swung slightly towards, I won't say peace, but to a certain degree of de-escalation. And now it's been pushed all the way back with immense energy in the opposite direction towards escalation and war. And that tells us how incredibly dangerous this whole situation is. But it also tells us again that there is a vacuum at the heart of US policy. There is nobody in Washington who has full control of the situation and who's able to chart a consistent course. Whenever there's a move in one direction, another faction comes in and pushes it back in the other. And this is incredibly dangerous, especially in a region like this, and it promises a further deterioration.
Yeah, and that was the danger of moving all those military assets to the region. I mean, once you start moving all those military assets there, it's you give an opening to the Warhawks, to the Neocons, and they're not going to just give up with this opportunity that they have in front of them to finally get this big war in the Middle East that they've been angling for so many decades. And because you don't have a strong executive, you don't really know who's calling the shots in the White House. You get these decisions where they're just moving all of these carriers and ships and all these weapons. They're just moved right into the Mediterranean, right into the region, into the Middle East. And now it's going to be incredibly difficult to pull that stuff back. I don't see it happening. I mean, my fear is that these people that want this war are not going to let it go until they get this war, with all the costs that it's going to inflict, all the damage it's going to do, even the damage it's going to do on the U.S. and even to Biden's reelection.
Yeah.
But You know, they've got everything there. That's the problem. They're sitting in DC and they're saying, look, we have everything in position. We've moved everything to the region. Now's our time to strike. That's what they're saying to themselves. And so any little pullback is going to be met with a whole ton of pushback.
Yeah. Yeah. What's been interesting to see unfold is that everything that the United States has done in response to Israel's response to October 7th, in response to this campaign, has almost been a kind of escalation, a provocation, similar to how NATO was encircling Russia to provoke such a conflict in Ukraine, and then, of course, using Ukraine to spark the conflicts of all conflicts, so to speak. It appears that just, while I believe surely Yemen and the Houthis are taking a stand very much independently, the rest of this process going on appears to be, as you said, Alex, it feels like almost opportunism. Like Israel's doing this right now. Well, we might as well get what we want out of this too, because when you have Hezbollah, these assassinations, Hezbollah, and then what happened in Iran, it does feel like the U.S., the neocons in particular, are almost giving zero options for these forces to do anything but engage more and get deeper and deeper into a regional conflict with the United States and with Israel.
I think this is absolutely correct. I mean, I think this is the tragedy of this whole conflict right from the beginning, and it's been the tragedy not for a long time, not just since the 7th of October, that whenever you get something happen, and in the Middle East, something always happens. I mean, until there is a general resolution of the crises in the Middle East, which is not impossible, it's not unachievable, but nobody is seriously trying to do that. Until there is a general resolution, there are lots of armed men, lots of violent people in the Middle East, and sooner or later something bad is going to happen. And whenever something bad happens, as night follows day, those who should be acting to try to keep things under control work to make them worse. Now, I mean, we were talking earlier in the program about Belgorod. I mean, Putin commented about the events in Belgorod, and just contrast the difference between what he said and the reaction of the Americans and the Israelis. He said, this is, on Russian television, he said, the attack on Belgorod was intended to provoke us into doing the same thing, to attacking civilian locations in Ukraine. And yes, we can do that. We can attack civilian places in Kiev, in any city in Ukraine. But we are not going to do that. And we're not going to do that for two reasons. Firstly, because doing that is wrong. But secondly, because it is what the other side wants us to do. We're not going to do what the other side wants us to do. We're not going to be manipulated. In the conflicts in the Middle East, there are some people who not only want to provoke conflict, but who, whenever something happens, like 7th October, they come and they insist that there must be exactly that kind of uncontrolled escalation, which Putin avoided over the events in Belgorod. And of course, it leads you ultimately into failure and a blind alley, and everybody can see it. But in Washington, calls for restraint, and this is a real problem, never seem in the end to prevail. Always, the odds seem to be stacked in favor of those who demand escalation. And that is why, as Alex rightly said, we are heading steadily towards a major smash in the Middle East, which will not be to the advantage of the United States or to Israel or to the collective West. We've had 30 years of war in the Middle East. Every single one of these wars has ended badly for the West. Declining influence, declining prestige, declining positions in the Middle East, lots of losses, lots of disillusionment in the West. But nonetheless, the calls for escalation, for more conflict, are always there.
Yeah. Nothing more to add there, Alexander. Yeah, it's going to be so hard for them to pull back everything they moved into position. I hope they do. I hope the U.S. pulls back everything that they've got in the region, but it's going to be impossible for them to do it.
Yeah. Then why would the United States do this? Because I was under the impression for many years now, especially after the conflict in Ukraine became a special military operation, so to speak. But even well before that, it was quite clear that the U.S. political establishment, the neoconservative foreign policy establishment, but really the entirety of, especially the American political establishment, military establishment, are moving away from West Asia, away from the Middle East, toward Russia and China. An admission, I think Afghanistan taught a pretty hard lesson. But even before 2021, there was movements away, almost a deprioritization, so much so that I think the U.S. was kind of caught with its pants down a bit when October 7th happened, because the U.S. has a lot of military installations and they have a heavy presence militarily, but they weren't really doing much. I mean, they were causing chaos and whatnot, but they weren't in an offensive position, and it wasn't being prioritized. So why then would, if there are these grand plans for a broader war with Russia, broader war with China, why would West Asia, the Middle East, just because of what happened October 7th, significant? Israel's, of course, campaign just absolutely kind of mind-boggling in terms of its scale of damage. But at the same time, we know the U.S. is pretty okay with that kind of thing. So why then would an investment in West Asia be so much a priority, given Iran wasn't trying to have any kind of conflict for this entire period? And it's been said in certain circles of the foreign policy establishment that a conflict in Iran would be absolutely disastrous in and of itself.
I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the United States, in theory, has been trying to prioritize its confrontation with China. And getting bogged down in the Middle East makes absolutely no sense from an American point of view if you follow that kind of calculus. And you could argue, I mean, if you accepted the kind of absurd thinking that we were talking about Russian weakness, why conflict with Russia might work to your advantage in terms of success against China. But again, since that has not worked out, logically, rationally, if you follow through with your own logic, you should be trying to find a way out of the conflict with Russia, and so that, again, you can focus on China. But that, of course, assumes that you're a rational person, and the Neocons are not. This is the fundamental problem. Now, the Neocons want a confrontation in the Middle East for a variety of reasons. Firstly, because straightforwardly, they have wanted a war with Iran for 30 years, longer, in fact. So always they come back to that visceral need to have a confrontation with Iran. Alex was talking earlier in the program about their visceral feelings, their loathing of Russia, their loathing of Putin, the fact that they're driven by that kind of emotional feeling. It's the same with Iran. In some cases, it's even stronger with some of them where Iran is concerned. So there is this issue. So this is now the opportunity to start a war. The second is that the Neocons have a cultured, not just the Washington bureaucracy, but much of the thinking community, if you like, in the West, to see restraint and moderation and calculation as a sign of weakness. So Whereas Putin, who is a very strong leader, and he's made a mistake about this, can say, I'm not going to do what the other side wants me to do. I'm not going to do something wrong over Belgorod. And nobody in Russia thinks that this is a sign of weakness. They see it instead as a sign of strength. In Washington, any sign of softness is immediately criticized as a sign of weakness. And the idea is, you strike at Iran, because if you don't strike at Iran, the Chinese are going to think you're weak, and for that reason, you must strike at Iran. You must show always that you are strong and that you will respond belligerently and violently and in this kind of way. Now, the Chinese actually don't think like that at all. But that is the kind of thing that people in Washington say. When there was the Istanbul negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, which almost ended in peace, the rationalization that the US gave for wrecking the peace talks is that it would reward aggression by Russia, and that would encourage China. So you can see the kind of mindset that comes into play there. So that is the second factor. And then the third factor, again, from a neocon perspective, is that neocons are geared towards wanting conflict and war. It's almost irrelevant for them where that conflict is, be it with Russia, be it with Iran, be it in China, be it with someone else, because war is what makes them strong in Washington. And perhaps for them, that is the single most important consideration of all.
Yeah, war is what keeps them in power. And they're all over the place in the permanent state. They are the permanent state. That's why for them, it doesn't matter which administration it is. Republican, Democrat, they don't care. They're going to be there, and they especially have control of the State Department. The State Department is where they run the show. Whether it's Obama, whether it's Bush, whether it was Trump, it doesn't matter. They're a permanent fixture in the State Department. So when they put out the policy, that's what's going to be followed. So I mean, yeah, it's like Alexander says, it's they always have this need as well to. It's as if the world is a bunch of children and they're the parent, and you're not behaving. We always have to. This country's not behaving the way we want it to behave, and they actually use that word often. Unless Russia changes their behavior, then we're not going to lift the sanctions. Unless Russia changes their behavior, then we're not going to stop sending weapons. Or the same with Iran. They have to change their behavior. And it's this constant that you see coming out of the neocons and out of DC. It's always about, projecting their strength. We don't want to look weak. We don't want to reward bad behavior. If we don't hit Iran, well, then we're rewarding bad behavior. And then China's going to see that Iran is getting rewarded for their bad behavior, and then we're going to have to punish China as well. That's why they're going sanctions crazy. That's why they go sanctions crazy. I was reading today, just a couple of hours ago, that they're now going to sanction North Korea and Iran and Russia again. I mean, to what end? But because they're not behaving, they're misbehaving. Because North Korea sold Russia weapons or something. I mean, it's you're not behaving the way we want you to behave. So now we're going to punish you. But all this stuff is exactly what's driving the world towards BRICS. It's all of these things that the rest of the world, the 80% of the world, is just like, I've had enough. I've had enough of this stuff. And they have a choice, and that's why they're going the route of BRICS. It's just one final point, which we haven't mentioned. I mean, and we did a show on this, me and Alexander, France has been kicked out of Africa. Niger kicked them out. This would have never happened 5 years ago. This would have never happened 3 years ago. Because they now have a choice. Countries now have an option. And that's why we're seeing all this change. And that's why we're going to see a very bumpy 2024, to say the least, a very turbulent 2024.
Yeah, no, it's you're exactly right. And I think the combination of having that example of a Russian victory, ostensibly, I know we're still in attrition, it has an over, but it's basically over, and the world can see exactly all the damage that was caused on by the other side, and all of the prospects that Russia brings. And the same goes for all of these conflicts. I mean, China has not been deterred, has not been weakened, despite all the media clamor of collapse here, collapse there. There's no collapse anywhere with regard to China. And then in West Asia, I mean, however this is going to go, if there is any kind of regional conflagration, I cannot predict that this will go well for the United States or for Israel. I mean, Israel has already suffered, I think, mightily in the court of public opinion, but it's going to suffer much more if it does have to contend with a more interventionist Hezbollah or Iran or any other force, for that matter, that is quite angry with what they have done. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.